everyone, and welcome to a new video. I have to film not one, but two videos for Patreon today and clean my sewing room, and I'm 2 hours behind because I had to take my dog to an emergency vet appointment. And my entire life over the past couple of weeks has been vet appointments. And I wanted to make a video where I can talk about that and also give you a little update on my dogs. Because in my last Chatty Sewing vlog, I talked about my new puppy and the first week of having her. And now it has been a month since she came into my life. So I want to talk about how she's getting along with my other dog. And I also want to make a dress. In my last video, I followed a New York company pattern, and today I'm going to be following another one. This was a dress I considered making last time, but it lost out to the one with tie shoulders that I ultimately ended up making. I thought this is really cute. It has a similarly flared skirt. It has a bodice fitted with darts at the underbust, and then it has spaghetti straps and optional ruffle. But you guys know how I feel about ruffles. Ruffles are never optional, regardless of what you're making. I truly think every garment in the universe would be better with ruffles. Everyone should just wear sequined, ruffly pink garments at all times. If a genie granted me 3 wishes, that would be one of them. Like fixing world hunger or making everyone wear pink, which would really be better for humanity. That being said, I probably won't be making this dress pink because I have a tragic lack of pink fabric in my life. And I'm not even sure what fabric I'm going to use for this dress, but I do want to make it. And before I can make it, I have to make a mock-up. Now, the last dress ended up fitting relatively nicely, but the mock-up did not fit particularly well. So I think it's important that I make another one this time around. So here is my beautiful mock-up. I took a photo of what this looks like on, so I will insert that here. I didn't take a photo of what it looked like before alterations because it didn't fit at all. So first of all, I think these straps are supposed to go inside here, but that just looked really awkward and close together. So I ended up putting them on the left of the marking as opposed to the right. Also, once I adjusted this so the darts were hitting my bust at the right point, it was too short. So I'm going to have to add about a ½ inch to the bottom edge. I also found that it was just generally too large for me in the bust, and I don't really want to fuss around with the darts, so I think I'm just going to take the top of the side seams in by about a ½ inch. Again, to get it to fit nicely, once the darts were adjusted properly, I ended up having to take the straps up pretty significantly. And I also found once the darts were in the right place on my bust, the neckline seemed really high, and it looked okay, but I think once I add the ruffles, it's going to just look sort of stuffy. So I decided to lower the neckline. Since I'm going to be taking this in by a ½ inch here, I might move this dart so it extends another ½ inch into the bust. And I think that is it as far as changes go, so I just have to transfer these onto my pattern or make notes of them onto the pattern, so when I go to cut out the final garment I have a better idea of what to do. And before I cut out the final garment, I need to figure out what fabric I'm going to use. So I guess I have to raid my stash to see what I can come up with, and I probably also have to pre-wash it because I didn't plan particularly well for this video. So it has been well over a week since I've attempted to film for this video, and you're probably seeing footage that I filmed a couple days ago when I was cutting this out. So after making the pattern alterations, I laid all of the pieces onto my fabric and began cutting them out using normal scissors as opposed to pinking shears. That's because I'm going to be finishing the majority of the seams in this project with French seams. I added an extra ½ inch of seam allowance to the sides of the bodice. I also decided to add 1 inch to the back edge of the pieces as opposed to cutting it on a fold, so I can have the zipper placed at the back where it will be much easier to get in and out of as opposed to a side zip like vintage dresses tend to favor. In my last video when I followed a New York company pattern, I found that the skirt was sort of lacking in the volume department. And though I don't want a super full skirt by any means, I did cut the pieces to be slightly wider where my fabric allowed it. And then after everything was cut out, I went ahead and cut out the facings, and they tell you to make a 2-inch wide bias facing to finish off the neckline, but that means that you end up having to sort of pleat the bias facing to get it around the corners of the bodice. So I decided to just lay my pieces out on fabric I had left over and trace around the top edges of them, and then measure 2 inches away from that traced line to create more fitted facings for these edges. So now everything is cut out. So these are all the pieces. That is my remaining fabric. This is the zipper I'm going to use. It's probably too bulky of a zipper for this, but it's the only one I have on hand that is black and the right length. And I think the gold will actually be an interesting bit of contrast. And then I picked up this lace trim in a Facebook group that I'm part of. And I thought it might be sort of cool to have some of this running around the bottom edge of the ruffles and potentially the edges of the straps. So I'll probably play around with that when I get to that in the future. And for this pattern, I am actually sort of following the instructions. I am going to read them, unlike last time, just because the neckline for this is more involved. There are sections that are gathered as well as the tops of the ruffles, and it's just a little bit fiddly, so I want to make sure I'm doing that properly. Alright, so I just quickly read through these, and it looks like the bodice assembly is pretty straightforward. They want you to sew up the darts, sew up the side seams, and then add the bias facing. Then you seam together the ruffle pieces and create a hem at the bottom edge and a channel at the top edge for elastic to feed through. So I can go ahead and do all without checking in on these too much. And then I haven't read the part about the skirt, but it looks based off of the illustration that it is just evenly gathered all the way around the top edge. I'm assuming the side seams of the skirt back and front pieces align with the bodice back and front pieces, and they are just seamed together at the sides. And for the side zipper, you would leave this portion open, but since I'm doing a back zipper, I'm just going to leave the center back seam open. And I did add an extra inch to that edge, so it will match up with the extra inch I added to the back of the bodice pieces, as opposed to cutting it on a fold like they originally recommend. And then this is all strap and hemming instructions and ruffle attaching instructions, which we won't need until a little bit later. So for now, focusing on assembling the ruffles and also assembling the bodice, and then we will join them together in a bit. Also, I explained this in my last video, but I will mention it just one more time. But this is a perforated pattern. New York company patterns were perforated, I think right up until the company went out of business or was sold. So that means they don't have any markings on them. Instead, everything is indicated with perforations. So it has notches like modern patterns do, but also has circular perforations, and these ones mark where the pocket should go. This little V shape marks edges that are meant to be cut on a fold. These little perforations here mark where the hem is meant to be turned inward, and then on the bodice pieces you'll once again have perforations marking where darts should be. So that's how patterns were still legible and still very usable even before they were being printed. So I know I was just talking about the bodice, but I think I'm going to go ahead and get the skirt pieces seamed together as well, just because that's something easy that I can do and get out of the way. I'm not going to bother cutting the notches at the side seams because it's pretty obvious which seams go together. But I will go ahead and clip these notches at the top edge just because those are going to make it easier to match it up with the bodice later on. And I'm going to get some better scissors. I bought this super cute scissor set. Like, look at this. And they're actually really surprisingly nice and high quality. And obviously the best part is that they're aesthetic and they match my sewing room. I might be considering switching over to using a vintage machine full time and getting it painted teal. And the fact that I could get it painted teal isn't a reason to make that switch. Or at least it's not the main reason, but it is a reason in my eyes because I appreciate things being color coordinated that much. This is the center back edge, and it's going to be very obvious that that is the center back once I do up the side seams. So I'm not going to bother labeling it. And I'm also going to add an extra notch just to the center front of the skirt, so that'll make it easier to line up with the bodice as well. I'm not even going to bother pinning these entire seams because I'm pretty lazy, and also they're straight seams and cotton isn't particularly prone to shifting. So I'm just going to do a couple pins at the top so I know which edges to sew together. And I'm going to sew these together with the wrong sides facing each other, and then I'll trim it and press it, and then I'll sew it again with the right sides facing each other to create nice little French seams where the raw edges are encased. So that is the skirt that I can set aside for now. I often work by marking everything and pinning everything and then going over to the sewing machine in one trip. My sewing machine is literally 2 steps away, yet I still do this. And they don't talk about it until much later on in the instructions, but it looks like for the strap they fold it in half lengthwise and then sew across the long edge. So I will go ahead and pin that as well. Because instructions are just a suggestion, and I feel like you can do things in whatever order makes the most sense to you. And clearly whatever requires the fewest trips to the sewing machine. I'm also just going to pin together my facing pieces. And the back ruffle I cut on the fold, but it is going to have a center back seam, so I actually have to cut it in 2. These pieces are the full width of the fabric, so they're actually the salvages of the material on one side, which is the pre-finished edge of the fabric that is finished during the weaving process. So instead of sewing these as French seams to avoid fraying, I can just sew them as normal seams and take advantage of that pre-finished edge. And the trick here is going to be making sure that I don't sew these together so the design is upside down on one side. And now for the most involved pieces, the front and backs. And for these I have to mark the dart placement. And I really want to use a Sharpie to mark the dart placement because this fabric is dark and it won't show, but I feel like you guys are going to get mad at me if I do. So I guess instead I will use a colored pencil. And I don't want to recommend you do this because it's unsanitary at best and dangerous at worst, but if you take just a Crayola colored pencil and you get it wet, perhaps using saliva, then it makes it way softer and it marks stuff way better. If you just get it a little bit wet, then you can easily mark through those perforations and have the darts neatly marked on your fabric. And then once that's removed, you can more easily put pressure on the material and use chalk to mark the actual lines of the darts. And if you're wondering what I'm using here, these are not marshmallows. Sometimes people ask that.
They're called Wonder Weights, and I think they've since been discontinued. For many decades they were being produced, and they can be an alternative to pins just to weigh down material and prevent it from shifting when you're doing things. So I've built up a little collection of them over eBay throughout the years. And my other pattern weights, which I'm not using today, are by June Taylor. These were produced, I think, in the 60s. And they're in the shape of like a sewing machine and scissors and an iron. And they're really, really cute. I got 2 sets super cheap at an estate sale. And you'll pay a pretty penny for them on eBay if you want to get your own sets. Now with the Dart Smart, I can just fold the fabric at what I think is the center of the dart. And then start pinning at the bottom and making sure that my pins are going through the chalk markings on both sides. And then once the bottom one is lined up, I do the top one, and then I just put a pin in the middle. So I have to repeat this for this dart and then the 2 on the front. I suppose while I do this, I can talk about why this video has been so difficult to film. I originally started this at the end of June when I had Patreon commitments to make, so that was sort of a poor time to start filming in the first place. And then I ended up having to take my dog to the vet, and when I take my dog to the vet, it's like a whole day event because she gets so stressed and anxious, and she's exhausted after, and I'm exhausted after because it's just not fun for either of us. But I did take her in because she had a loose tooth that I noticed when I was brushing her teeth, because I'm a dog mom who does that. And I called, I think, at 9 when they opened, and they had an appointment at 9:40. And I figured they were just going to do blood work so she could get a dental done in the future and they could pull it. And then the vet comes out and he comes back with the tooth. And he's like, it was so loose, I just pulled it. And he's like waving around this tooth. It has the whole root attached and everything. And in hindsight, I really should have asked more questions, like, why did she have a loose tooth? Is she likely going to have more? Is there anything I can do to prevent that? But I was just so kind of shocked about the presence of the tooth being there, and I was so not expecting it that I just sort of laughed a little. And then they did end up taking blood work, and she's still going to get a dental cleaning, which I'm so nervous about. But putting a little dog under anesthesia really scares me. I don't want anything bad to happen to her, but I know good dental health in dogs is important. Those of you that don't know, I just adopted her in November, and she's 6 years old. So I've been brushing her teeth really pretty frequently since getting her, but she had a lot of buildup and really pretty stinky breath from her previous 6 years of life. So I know if that can get cleaned up, then she'll sort of be set up for success in the future and hopefully never need another one. But it still scares me potentially having her go under. So that was one day, and then the next day I thought I broke my nose, or rather I thought Minnie, my newly rescued dog, broke my nose. My mom's dog was outside and Minnie really wanted to go out, and I didn't want her to pee in her enthusiasm to go outside, so I decided I would lift her up while we waited. I reached down to lift her up and she jumped up at the same time, and the top of her head smacked into the tip of my nose, and I heard it crack, and it really, really hurt. And then that entire day, my nose was just throbbing. Day 2, my nose was just throbbing and aching. And now it has settled to a point where it just hurts if you touch it. And it hurts quite a lot if you touch it. But I don't think it's broken. There's no bruising. There's no trouble breathing. There's no blood. So I think I'm in the clear, but it definitely hurt and it continues to hurt. And like when the center of your face is just aching, it makes it really hard to concentrate and work. So I ended up just doing some editing. And I guess that explains away why I didn't get work done for 3 days. And I'm honestly not sure what I've been doing for the rest of the week. I'm going to do a whole bunch of sewing. Actually, I've probably already done a bunch of sewing and you've seen it while I've been talking. And I've just sewn everything that you saw me pin. And after I explain what the next step is, I'll explain more of my dog woes regarding Minnie. Okay, so I did a bunch of sewing and then a bunch of ironing, mostly just pressing seams open and pressing darts to the side. So now I can go ahead and sew up the side seams of the bodice. I also pressed the bottom edge of the facing inward by 1/4 inch, and I'm just going to top stitch that down, and then that edge will ultimately be slip stitched to the interior of the bodice to prevent fraying. For the ruffle, they wanted me to turn the bottom edge inward by 1/2 inch and to baste it down or to sew it down, but then you're going to have a frayed edge at the bottom, which I really didn't want, especially since the ruffle is almost 3 yards long. It would just look bad. So I decided instead I would do a rolled kind of 1/3 of an inch hem and just end up with a slightly narrower ruffle. They also wanted me to turn the top edge inward by a 1/2 inch twice and stitch near the edge to create a channel for the elastic, so I will be doing that as well. So since I sewed the darts and pressed the darts, I could then sew up the side seams of the bodice. And I'm just trimming the seam allowance down to a little less than 1/4 inch. And I'm going to press this seam open off camera, and then I'll be right back. And now you can see the seam line right here, and I'm just going to fold the fabric on that seam line and then pin it again so the right sides are facing each other. And I ended up cutting down the front neckline of the bodice, but I forgot to mimic that at the edge of the back piece. So the seam doesn't line up perfectly, and that's going to make sewing on the facing kind of troublesome, but I'm going to do the best job I can. So now this can be sewn with a 1/2 inch allowance. I just have to repeat that process on the skirt pieces. So in this video, I wanted to give you a little bit of an update on how my rescue dog Minnie is doing and how she's getting along with Posy. In my last vlog, I'd had her for about a week, and now I've had her for about a month. So she's settled in a lot more. Her behavior's changed a lot as she's gotten more comfortable, but she is still so active and she just always wants to play. She has so much energy. I'm wondering if her age is correct or if she's actually like only 7 months or 8 months old, because she's just so, I don't know, vivacious and playful, and I've never had a dog like that before, and it requires a lot more time and energy than any other dog I've had before. But she's also just super sweet and super cute and super lovable, and I feel very grateful to have her in my life. In my last video, one of my major woes and concerns was her getting along with my other dog, Posy, and I'm happy to report that they're getting along much better. When we first got Minnie, she was sort of scared of Posy, and Posy would bark at her because she wanted to play, and Minnie was just sort of confused, and they didn't seem to have the same play language. But now they definitely understand each other a little bit more, and Minnie is the one who barks at Posy because she wants to play a lot more often than Posy does. So they probably play for like an hour a day. They'll play tug of war over toys, and they will wrestle, and they sound like beasts while they're at it. They seriously, I don't know what my neighbors think when they're fighting in the yard. They must think we have a dog fighting arena out there. But they're both like active participants in the play, and they both return to each other to play, and they chase each other, and they seem to be having a good time. And neither of them are getting hurt, so I'm just letting them go at it, but it is sort of scary to hear them play because it is so growly and vicious and loud. And I think part of it is just because beagles are a very vocal breed. They do that, and then they'll play over toys. Minnie is such a little sneak. Even if I buy 2 of the exact same toy, she wants the toy Posy is playing with. The only issue is when Posy is uncomfortable. So on July 4th, there were so many fireworks, and Posy was really upset and tense, and then Minnie approached her, and she got snappy. But it really is just so nice, and it makes me so happy seeing them play with each other and have a good time. That was really what I wanted out of getting a second dog. Right now they're just at like the physical stage of their relationship where, you know, they're going at it with each other, but I want them to get to the comfortable stage where they'll sleep in the same bed together. So that's kind of my next milestone that I'm hoping and working towards. But I am happy that they're just getting along and playing thus far. That was probably a long and boring ramble. I apologize, but here is my little ruffle. It's not perfectly even. The lace was very difficult to sew on, and I didn't do any measuring when it came to the hem, but I think it's going to be fine. So I have the hem at the bottom, which is stitched on, and then I also have the lace, which is sewn on. And then at the top edge, I have this channel, which is left open, so you can see me pushing the pencil in there. That's where my elastic is going to go. And they say in the instructions to use a 38-inch long length of elastic, so that is what I've cut. But I think I might end up cutting it shorter just because this feels like a very, very long strip of elastic, but we'll see. So what I'm going to do is get a bobby pin, and a few inches away from the end, I'm going to put the bobby pin on the elastic, and I'm just going to thread it through using the bobby pin. And a lot of people like using safety pins for this, but I've had a couple occasions where the safety pins have opened in the inside of the channel, and I've actually had to rip the channel open in order to rescue the safety pin, which is now jabbing into the fabric. So I like using a really large eye, sort of blunt needle that would be used for knitting or tapestry work, or I like using a bobby pin. And the elastic can slip out of either of those, but it's usually not a huge problem. Now the issue here is that there's a seam pocket that's relatively large. I have to make sure I'm getting through the center of the seam so I don't get caught in the little seam pocket. So though they're getting along now, I have been having some little medical issues with Minnie. She passed her checkup with flying colors, but she was peeing inside. And it started with just like an accident or two a day, which I was willing to put down to the fact that she was in a new environment and around strangers, and, you know, accidents happen. And I just found a section where the channel isn't sewn shut, so I have to fix that, and then I'll be back. Then she started peeing inside more and more, so I decided to bring a urine sample to the vet and have them test it to see if it was a UTI. And it came back negative, but my vet said, you know, if she's acting like she has a UTI, we can do antibiotics anyway. So we decided to move forward with the antibiotics, and the vet said to call back in a week with an update. And I called back in a week, and it wasn't better. If anything, it was worse. She was peeing inside sometimes multiple times a day. She was drinking a ton of water, like 10 or 12 cups of water a day. And she didn't seem to know when she was going to pee. So it wasn't just an issue that she wasn't alerting me that she had to go outside. It was an issue of she would stand up and then she would just squat and pee right where she was. Or she'd be playing and she'd be distracted and then she'd pee. So to prevent accidents inside, I had to take her out basically anytime she moved. And since she is a very active, very young dog, she moved a lot. So I basically couldn't edit. I couldn't get any work done because I was just super hyper fixated on her actions. So I could take her out as much as I thought was necessary, which was quite literally sometimes every 5 minutes. I took her in for her follow-up, and they did blood work and to see if it was diabetes or a kidney problem or Cushing's disease or anything. Luckily, that all came back negative, but in the car ride home, she peed in her car crate. And her car crate is tiny. She was basically sitting in her pee on the way home, which a dog just does not do if they have any other option. And at that point, I knew, like, this isn't a behavioral issue. This is, like, something she can't control. So we tried stronger antibiotics, and I also decided to try switching her to different food. I had her on the same food she was eating at the rescue. And as soon as I swapped out, even with like 50% of the food that I typically feed my dogs, she was better, like just so much better. The accidents dropped off a lot. Her water drinking slowed down a lot. And it's just continued to get better and better as I've transitioned her off of that food. And now she's fully on a different food. She's still drinking a lot of water, and she's still having accidents. She's especially having accidents in the crate, which is really bizarre and frustrating because dogs are supposed to view that sort of like their den, their bed, you know? You don't usually go to the bathroom where you sleep and eat. So that's still really frustrating, and we're kind of working on that. But she definitely seems to have more control over her bladder than she did before. And I'm hoping it's just going to take kind of a while for the kidney issues to resolve. What my vet thinks it was is Fanconi syndrome brought on by the food she was on previously. Or rather, Fanconi-like syndrome, because it's not like an issue with the structure of her kidney. It was an issue with irritation from what she was feeding to her kidneys. So hopefully, as that irritation continues to fade, she'll get more continent. But we went like 5 days without any accidents inside, and now she's back to having one pretty consistently every day. So maybe it's another UTI, maybe it's not, but it's still significantly better than it was before, which is just such a relief, because I seriously had several weeks there where I couldn't get any work done because I was so fixated on her, and I couldn't have her crated up here because she would pee in her crate after a matter of minutes. So that was really just unfortunate for everyone involved. With that being said, now my ruffle is complete. So once I have the bodice further along, I will try pinning this on and potentially adjusting the elastic and making it shorter to have it sit more tightly over my shoulders. But for now, I'm just going to leave it as is and then get back to working on the bodice. So I have to sew up those side seams, and then I can try it on. Actually, even though it is one of the last steps they tell you to do a good fitting, I should pin the straps in place, and to do that, I will have to turn these right side out. So maybe I will do that really quickly, and then I'm going to take a lunch break. So my preferred way of turning something right side out is using a needle. So you want a needle that is sharp enough that it can puncture through something, but not so sharp that it will be likely to get caught on the fabric when you're threading it through the fabric. So I start just by bringing that needle through about a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the material, and then there's a knot on one end of the thread. And instead of using thread, I actually like to use some sort of cordage or something that won't be inclined to break when you put a lot of pressure on it. And then you just thread the needle through the tube. And this is pretty easy to turn right side out. It's actually relatively wide, but you can use this method for turning out tubes that are like a 1/4 inch wide. So then you just want to pull sort of on the end until the edges start tucking themselves inward to the tube. And sometimes you have to help it along, especially if it's a smaller tube. But then you can just put steady pressure on the thread that you have through it and continue to feed the material through the tube. And then once that's done, you can just clip off that knot that was mounting it to the edge, and you have a tube that's turned right side out. I don't know if that made any sense. I'll show it to you again. So you create a knot in the end of that thread, and then you bring it up about a 1/4 inch away from the bottom edge, and then you just bring it through the tube. And as I said, I've done this for tubes that are like a 1/4 inch wide and 5 yards long, though it is a little bit more tedious to do that. And when you're doing that, you sometimes have to use like pins and stuff to start it turning inward on its own. But once it starts turning inward, it is really pretty easy to pull and turn right side out. So there you can see it starting, just kind of feeding it through itself, and then putting steady pressure on that thread and pulling the tube along until it's turned right side out. And then clipping that knot off. So now these are going to be pressed, so the seam is at the back side, and then I'll have nice little straps. So there are my straps, all pressed and pretty, and I have to decide if I want to outline these with lace as well, or if it's enough just going around the edge of the ruffle. But again, that is a decision for later me to make, and current me is going to go downstairs, let the dogs out, and get some lunch. I have one sleepy puppy over here. Posey always looks so grumpy. I promise she's not always grumpy, but she just has a hound face that makes her look grumpy. And then over here we have Hermione, who also goes by Minnie, and Min Min needs a good stretch after being cooped up. So the facing is now sewn on. That didn't go as well as I wanted. When I lined these side seams at the facing up with these side seams of the bodice, I ended up with about 2 inches of extra material at the center front, so I ended up having to sew a little seam there, and now there's a break in the hemline, but it should be fine. Also, because I had to trim this portion down because I didn't adjust the back piece to have the same lower neckline as the front, the facing couldn't go up as high, so I ended up having to sew it on with the 5/8 of an inch allowance just to have enough seam allowance at that point. So it's not perfect, but it's going to be fine. And now I'm just going to clip the corners and notch the curves and then flip the facing inward where it can be hand stitched down. In the last clip I showed you what the facing looked like after it had been sewn on, and I went ahead and pressed it and folded it inward, and then I just slip stitched it down. So now it is neatly secured and won't flip out when it's washed in the future. I realized this looks like a total mess, but I went ahead and pinned a zipper into the back and did a fitting, and it fit surprisingly well. I also pinned these straps in, and they don't want you to sew on the straps until the very end, but I actually think I'm going to remove some of the stitching securing the facing on and tuck the strap in between the 2 layers of fabric and then top stitch it closed, because you won't see that stitching with where the ruffle is, and that will be a lot more secure than me just stitching it on by hand. I did end up moving the straps at the front over by about 1 inch, but now I think they look nice, and I actually think the length of the elastic and the ruffle is really nice too. I like how it drapes over the shoulders. So I can go ahead and top stitch like right here and then cut the elastic so there isn't this end sticking out and there isn't a pin just securing it in place. So that's probably what I'm going to do next, and then I will rip out that little section of the facing so I can install the straps. Oh, and since I've done a fitting and it fits in the waist, I can go ahead and gather down the top edge of the skirt to match the measurement of the bottom edge of the bodice. So I'll be doing that in a moment as well. I don't know if you'll be able to see what I'm doing at all, but I'm just going to go ahead and rip out some of the stitches that secure the facing to the top edge of the bodice. And I'm going to rip out all the way past the pin that I'm using to mark where the strap is going to go. And then I can take my strap and tuck it between those 2 layers of fabric, like so, and adjust it until the top edge of the bodice is level with the pin marking the length of the strap. And then I can pin it in place. Actually, I want to slide it over so it's right up against the pin marking the position of the strap. So now I'm going to, if I machine, just stitch right across there, very close to the edge, and I'm going to go a little bit past the strap in each direction to secure the portion that I ripped open, and then the ruffle is going to cover that top stitching later on. So I just have to repeat this on this side and then also for the back portions of the straps. Alright, so the ends of my ruffles are now finished. The elastic isn't poking out and they are nice and stretchy. I've also gotten the strap sewn on. I think the next step in the instructions was sewing on the ruffle, but I think the ruffle will be easier to arrange and position after the skirt is sewn on. And then after the skirt's sewn on, I can sew in the zipper, and I actually finished the ends of the ruffle with lace. So instead of having them be part of the seam with the zipper, they're going to be positioned just outside the teeth of the zipper, so it'll be easier to sew the ruffle on in its entirety after the zipper is in place, which can't be done until the skirt is on. So I just went ahead and sewed 2 rows of stitching using a relatively long stitch length across the entire top edge of the skirt, and one is placed about 1/3 of an inch away from the top edge and the other is placed 1/4 inch below that. And since I used a relatively loose or relatively long stitch, I can actually pull on the threads and that will cause the fabric to gather up. I'm wondering if I made a mistake on this and that the thread will be too weak for this to work and it'll break in the process of gathering, but if it does work, then it's going to be way faster than gathering this down by hand, so I definitely want to give it a try. And I want to hold off until doing that until after I've done the fitting, because now I know that the bottom edge of this is the same length that I want the top edge of my skirt to be. So I gotta get that gathered. Alright, so I went ahead. Thank you for shaking, Cozy. Now you're gonna lick my leg. That's great. So after I finished gathering the top edge of the skirt down to the length or the width of the bodice, I went ahead and tied the thread off and then arranged the gathers so they're even. I aligned the side seams of the skirt with the side seams of the bodice and got it pinned on. And then I sewed it on using 2 rows of stitching just so that seam is nice and durable. And now I'm going to trim the seam allowance to sit just past that second line of stitching. And after this is done, I'm going to press the seam allowance upward so it is in the bodice, and then I can start sewing on the zipper. And I'm not going to film sewing on the zipper because I hate sewing on zippers, and trying to document the process on camera makes it like twice as frustrating. So that is not going to be happening today, but I will return and show you what it looks like when the zipper is on in just a moment. Well, it'll be a moment for you. It'll be like 15 minutes of frustrated cursing for me. I just pressed the seam allowance upward, and I actually pressed the gathers after gathering them prior to pinning it onto the skirt just so they'd be a little bit flatter. And now before doing up the zipper, I'm actually going to go through and pull out that line of gathering stitches that extends beyond the seam allowance. That second row of gathering just helps control the fabric below the seam allowance and makes it much easier to sew on without any fabric flipping up and getting caught in the seam, but doesn't look particularly nice, so I'm just going to rip it out while the garment is still flat prior to sewing on the zipper. And this is pretty easy to do because I used relatively large, almost basting size machine stitches to gather the material down. So my backdrop is an absolute mess right now, and I have a dress in front of my mirror, but this is what the dress looks like with the zipper in. So it's not super flattering, and this is a really unflattering angle, but I'm relatively happy with how it fits. So the next step is just going to be adding the ruffle. I really wish I could put on my dress form, but my dress form, as I said, has something on it, and I don't really want to take it off. So I think I'm just going to try and pin the ruffle while it's on me and get it arranged to a point where it looks nice. Also, just as a side note, the zipper was sewn into the back edge, and both the back edge of the skirt and the bodice pieces were cut on the selvage of the fabric, so I could turn it inward and just leave that edge free. I didn't have to do any pinking or finishing on it. I also folded the facing inward and stitched that down when sewing on the zipper. I still need to press it, but that is what the zipper looks like at a glance. So it is not fully covered. You do see some of the teeth, but I didn't want to sew right up super close to the teeth of the zipper because I didn't want the fabric to get caught in it when I was doing it up. So I pinned this the way the instructions told me to, where the elasticized, is that a word, edge is pinned just beyond where the straps end, and then this is going to be whip stitched down to the top edge of the bodice, and I'm going to repeat that on the back, and then the rest is left free to hang over the arms. I'm going to try this on to see how it fits, but there are also a lot of pins in there, so I'm not feeling too confident that I will be able to do that and get a good gauge of how it will fit, but I will at least try, and then I'll just slip stitch the ruffle on along that edge, and hopefully I will have a beautiful dress that then just needs to be hemmed. And hemming is sort of the fun part. I went ahead and trimmed the hem down by 2 inches because during my fitting I realized that the dress was awfully long, and according to the illustration on the cover it's supposed to be more of a knee length. So I cut off all that excess that I originally added to the skirt pieces, and then I marked a line 4 inches away from the bottom edge of the skirt, and I folded the hem up to meet that line, and I pressed it in position so it was neatly turned inward by 2 inches. Then I took it over to my sewing machine and sewed some rayon hem tape, which looks like this and is sort of like bias tape, but it is made out of rayon and is very common pre-1950. So I top stitched that about 1/4 inch away from the edge, and then I just pressed it again so it was folded upward and hides the raw edge. So now I just have to whip stitch down the top edge of the rayon tape, and this dress will be finished. I should probably add a hook and bar to the top, but I might not do that. We'll see. And I was looking through my patterns and I realized I have multiple copies of this pattern. So basically I bought this lot from someone on Facebook. It was over 500 New York Company patterns, and they all came out of a general store that had been abandoned since the 1960s. So all of the patterns are factory folded and in generally good condition. So I purchased all of them, and I've since organized them by size. So I have sizes for a 28-inch bust all the way up to, I think, a 48-inch bust. Yeah, I have this pattern in a couple other sizes that will be making their way to my Etsy shop at some point. If you didn't know, I have a pattern store as just a little side project / hobby. But since there are so many duplicate designs in this lot that are in different sizes, much easier for me to list them by just copying the listing for a previous size so that I don't have to retitle it or anything. So since I've been saving so much time by copying existing listings, I want to wait until I have all of the patterns listed to actually make them go live. Right now they're just drafts, because if I have some of them in my draft folder and some of them in my sold folder and some of them in my listed folder, it's going to be a lot more difficult to find the listings I need to copy. So I've listed like 100 so far, and I think I have 200 more to go before I can actually have any of these listings go live. So it's been super duper tedious to go through, but at this point they're all photographed, so it's really just taking the time to write the descriptions for them. So that has been a huge project, and I seriously have hundreds upon hundreds of these patterns just filling so many bins in my sewing room, and I'm looking forward to parting with the ones that I haven't chosen to keep, which is the vast majority. And I think the hem is done now. So let's look at some more photos of this and cut to an outro. Now the hem has been sewn and pressed, and I have put the dress on and I have photographed it. And I'm going to include some of those photos now.
If I look tired in these photos and in this footage, that is because someone, I don't want to mention any names, but this is the culprit, decided to chew through her fabric crate this morning at 6:30, causing my sleepy self to have to struggle to get her head out of the hole she had eaten in the cage and ultimately take her downstairs to go out. So that was how my day started. Sorry if I sound out of breath, I just had to run Minnie downstairs because she started peeing on a bed. So those are my feelings for the day so far. As for my feelings of this dress, they're a lot more positive. I think it's really cute. I've never had a dress with this off-the-shoulder sort of ruffle thing going on, but I think it's adorable, and I like that it offers some arm coverage but still relatively breezy for summer. I really like the fabric I used. Since it's a digital print, it looks relatively modern, but it's also quite a traditional looking floral pattern. It looks like something you could have seen in the 1850s or the 1950s. I think the bodice fits relatively well. My only issue is with the straps. I feel like now that the ruffles on, they look proportionally quite close together, even though I separated them by 2 inches more than the instructions told me to. I also feel like they might be too long. I really struggle with straps like this because depending on your posture, it depends how they fit and how they sit on your shoulders. So there might be some adjusting there, but I do feel like that's just the nature of a dress like this, as opposed to an error I made when making my mock-up or when constructing it. As for the construction, this went together pretty well and pretty easily. I started working on it for real at about 10 o'clock yesterday, and I think I'd finished it around 4, and there was a lunch break in between. So it really did come together very quickly and very easily. I hope you guys enjoyed watching me construct it, and I hope you enjoyed the pup date. I realize my channel has been very dog heavy in terms of content recently, but that will be changing. I'm actually going to include some photos now of historical projects that I've had in progress, some of which for an embarrassingly long amount of time, and some of which that were just started this week. But they have all been worked on this week, and I've slowly been trying to get them finished, and will hopefully be getting videos about them out to you very soon. So keep an eye out for those, and subscribe and stay tuned if you aren't already. And I'm sure there will be more vintage dress and pattern following content on this channel as well, though hopefully it'll be more about sewing and less about dogs, unless you're into that, because my dogs are like the most interesting part of my life, as sad as that may be. Before I go, I did just want to give a huge shout out and thank you to all of my wonderful, very patient patrons. There'll be a whole bunch of their names on screen, but I want to give a special shout out to my top tier patrons, who are Amanda Amateur, Cindy Nelson, Jamie Denon, Remy S., Mary Kinsey, Tracy Smith, Emma Hargrave, and Jordan Carpenter. These are the credits from June, and I'll be working my way backwards until I'm all caught up, which will hopefully be before the end of the month, because I do have quite a few videos planned for you this month. I think I'm going to play some Posy footage while I roll through these credits, because she hasn't gotten enough love in this video, though she has been getting lots of love in real life. Thanks so much for your support. Thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I will talk to all of you very soon.
I'm trying to take photos, and this is what I have to deal with. This dog digging dirt into my shoes. I've never seen her dig like this before. She just decided to do it because I was standing right here. And she's doing it quite aggressively. And now this one's over here rolling in something.